readers, I'm Annie. Fantasy romance and romantasy, I feel, are two completely different things. However, I feel they're a term that has been used a little bit interchangeably recently, and I kind of get it. Technically, as far as I'm aware, romantasy as its own independent genre isn't really a thing just yet, but I feel like it is around the corner. I feel like I've spoken about this in a couple of videos recently, but for me, they are two very different things. So in its very basic nature, fantasy romance is essentially a fantasy with a romance subplot, whereas romantasy, they're kind of equal, if not the romance being the primary point of it. Here's the thing that's really difficult about this as a topic is, whilst I kind of see them as two separate things, I feel like not everyone does, and where they're not really defined as independent genres, they are kind of fluid, and I feel like romantasy is kind of used a little bit as like one of those marketing terms, like enemies to lovers at the moment is being used for just about everything, and let me tell you, half the time they're not enemies to lovers. And we've kind of seen it recently on the Goodreads list of, they've now put up a romantasy segment for the best book of the year bit. They put up a romantasy segment for what was being read as like a mid-year check-in. I have to say, I kind of disagree with some of the titles on there. So I've picked out a bunch of books that I feel are either on one side or other of the line, but also there's a couple in here that kind of like bridge the line a little bit. So I just wanted to kind of talk about these. So starting off with ACOTAR. Now, I feel like book one is very much a fantasy with a romance subplot. The romance is important. The romance between Feyre and Tamlin is important because it is kind of one of the driving factors of the plot. However, the romance itself, like the actual interactions between them and the way that the romance of it develops, I feel is very much a subplot to the fantasy nature of what everything is going on in this world. Once you get to ACOMAF, however, I feel like this is more of a romantasy where the romance in this is so primary to everything, and it is one of the driving factors of these two characters who are now developing their own romance, and I feel like the romance in this is just like a lot more prevalent. It's a lot more forward facing. It kind of fuels a lot of the decisions that each of them make. And so this for me is a romantasy, whereas this is a fantasy romance. You can kind of see where I'm going with this a little bit. The Plated Prisoner series by Raven Kennedy, again, it kind of sits along that similar line. So you've got Guild, the first one, which is very much a fantasy with a romance subplot, to the point where I can barely remember any romance in this, aside from Oren, our main girlie, thinking that she wants, or like very loosely has, this little bit of romance with King Midas. That's kind of really as far as it gets, because he's got multiple essentially lovers that are employed by him. It's kind of a whole thing. If you've not read it, it's a really, really good series. I do really, really love it. But this first one is definitely a fantasy with a romance subplot. Like, it's very subplot. It's not really the focus. The focus is more on what's happening in the world, the magic, how Oren and Midas connect, like how important they are to each other. Like, that's kind of more the focus of it, rather than necessarily a romance between the two. Once you start to get along a little bit, I believe it's in sort of more Gleam, because you've then got Glint, which again is a little bit more fantasy romance because there's a lot really going on. When you get into Gleam, everything kind of like changes in the series, and we meet a whole bunch of new characters. I'm not going to spoil it because there is a lot that happens, just like still a little bit mind blown, honestly. Once you get to Gleam, that's where I feel like it kind of turns into a little bit more romantasy, because the romance plot in that is like so important to the setup of what kind of comes next in Glow. And then I've got Gold on my shelf, which is the latest one, and like you kind of need that like primary romance segment of it to kind of fuel what's going to go forward in the next few books, right? So again, this is another one that kind of like toes the line. It kind of depends on what's really happening. If the character decisions are more important, or like the actual base plot is more important in that precise moment in time, it's kind of, again, a little bit sort of like set up and execution, and that's kind of what determines for me if the individual books are fantasy romance or romantasy. But I'd say, like, again, a little bit like with ACOTAR, the primary focus of it is the fantasy romance aspect. I've put Throne of Glass on this list because I don't quite know where I stand with this one. This is very YA. In the first few books, any sort of romance we get is like very much behind closed doors. There is like zero spice. It's all closed door. Whereas ACOTAR and the Plays of Prisoner series have been on page thus far, whereas this is very much YA, which is why this for me falls under the fantasy romance category. As we go on in the series, there is a little bit more importance put on the romance, especially between two characters. I'm not going to spoil it because it is an absolutely huge series, and I'm aware that not everyone has actually read this, and there are some people still wanting to read this. Definitely get on top of that. Emily, I'm looking at you. You need to read it, okay? I don't know how many times I could tell you to read this series. Girl, you gotta read it. She's gonna hate me so much for that. In all honesty, the first few books of this very much are fantasy romance. As you get along a little bit, yes, the romance is important, but I feel the overarching plot of the entire series still holds significantly more prevalence than the romance plot of this entire series. Once you get to Tower of Dawn, that is just like a whole different thing on its own, because like I feel like we're playing Love Island or something. Kind of the whole point of that book is to essentially matchmake a bunch of people together. But at the same time, I still don't necessarily feel like there's any romance in it. Nothing actually happens enough for me to be like, this is like a romance-based book. So for me, and I know there's going to be people that disagree with me on all of these books, but look, this is just my opinion. Take it or leave it as you wish. This is just where I stand on is it a fantasy romance or a romantasy, because for me they are two entirely different things. But Throne of Glass for me is a fantasy romance. So let's change it up a little bit. Bride by Ali Hazelwood. This is 100% a romantasy, as far as I'm concerned. Why? Because it almost kind of falls under the line of paranormal romance, which I feel like we don't really see as much of in general media of like what's posted on TikTok and stuff. Like it's kind of one of these things that I feel like gets brushed under the carpet, and I'm not happy about that because paranormal romance is a vibe, okay? And I feel like this is very much that vibe. This is very much a romantasy. The romance in this is the primary focus point. The fantasy setting is the setting and not what's going on. The whole point of this is this kind of arranged marriage, and then we get this love story between Misery and Lo. You could put this in any world. Like, they don't have to be vampire and werewolf. They could be two humans in, like, I don't know, the States or middle of Europe or something. And, like, you could just change the fact that they're vampire and werewolf and the setting, and basically the story would be exactly the same if you put it in our world, right? The setting is the fantasy aspect of it. The focus is the romance, which is, for me, the point of a romantasy, because the romance bit comes first, the fantasy bit comes later. Do you get what I'm saying? I hope I'm making sense by this point. I'm never quite sure. And it's kind of the same for the early Dark Olympus books. The whole point of this is to be a romance set in a fantasy world. This fantasy world is kind of essentially an extension of our world, and essentially they just kind of like live in this basically secluded island that is a copy of Olympus. The early books in this very much are romance in a fantasy setting. Once you start to move along the series a little bit, I think it's by like book 5, book 6, we start to get a little bit more of the fantasy world, and like there's implications of like the outside world and what's happening within the world itself, and all of these like more fantasy elements of it start feeding in rather than just the romance. But definitely the early books are romantasy for sure, and the later ones I would probably say are still romantasy because the romance is still like the primary point of it, but you kind of get a little bit more of that. Like you get a little bit closer to the line because you're getting more of the world and the world building and what's going on and all this kind of like political stuff as well. So it kind of like starts to head towards the line, but I'm hoping that the rest of this series will stay on the line of romantasy because that's what I love it for. And finally, we have Fourth Wing. This is a book that confuses me as to where I feel like it sits on the line, because this book very successfully does 50-50, like straight up 50-50. The romance in this is so prominent and so prevalent, and the romance essentially directs a lot of the decisions that the characters make, which makes it a romantasy. However, because of the nature of the setting, because of the nature of what's going on in the background of the actual plot of the world and the plot of like what's driving these characters forward, what is making them, what is forcing them into certain decisions that aren't the romance-based decisions, it's a fantasy romance. So this one very successfully sits dead on the line. And I don't know what it is. You can't really classify it one way or the other. You can't really take the love story of Xaden and Violet outside of the world of Basgiath and make it make sense, because of how well integrated the world is, of how integrated the war is, and the school and the dragons and everything that's going on. You can't take them outside of that and make it make sense. However, if you take the romance out of this, it also doesn't make sense. If you take away the romance of these two characters, or like lessen it by a significant amount to make it more of a fantasy with a romance subplot, it also doesn't make sense, because a lot of their decisions are very much fueled by their feelings for each other. And if you take out those feelings or lessen those feelings, you sit there and you go, well, you wouldn't make that decision, would you? Like, it just doesn't make sense. Which is where I feel like this is like the perfect exception to the rule. Every time there's a rule, there has to be an exception. And the Empyrean series is that specific exception, because it sits so perfectly on the line that it is neither one nor the other. This is a topic I could go on and on and on about. And if you guys want to chat more, then do send me a message, get in touch. Let's have a full-on conversation about this. How do you guys feel about these? Are these all romantasy? Are these all fantasy romance? Or is it too close to be able to distinguish between one and the other? Because I feel like I know what I define it as, but I feel like where it's not officially defined, it's so open for interpretation, and I'd love to know what you guys think about it. So please do sound off in the comments, drop me a DM, like, let's have a full-on conversation about this, because this is something I could actually go on for hours about. This is the hill I will die on, okay? But thank you so much for coming to hang out with me. Check out all my socials below, check out my book in the link down below. But yeah, you guys know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, all that really fun stuff, and I will see you next time. Bye!